How's it going, guys? Cameron here with Canadian Gamer, back at you with another episode of On the Road again. And today we're going to talk about renting video games, what it was like to live in the late 80s, early to mid 90s, how that affected a lot of us as, again, children of the 90s. Now, I've been listening to a lot of this in my car lately. Alice in Chains, Best of the Box. It's a pretty rare CD. I bought this when it came out back in 99. So yeah, it's obviously translucent orange. Just wanted to show that off there. Love me some Alice in Chains. So again, talking about way back in the day, feels like it was just yesterday. When 88, 89 came around, again, my parents bought me and my sister an NES, but we weren't renting games at that time. Parents might have been, but we weren't. We didn't really start renting games until, to be honest with you, probably around 95, 96. And I can remember, we'll get to Blockbuster in a minute. I know that's the one everybody likes to talk about. I can remember in 1995, the convenience store in the small town that I lived in, you know, we'd bike up in our bicycles, and they'd always have a couple of SNES games that you could rent, and they had a couple of 64 games and Genesis. Those were the main consoles at the convenience store that they would rent out. You got to remember, from a rental perspective, sometimes it's easier to rent out the cart than it is the DVD or the CD-ROM disc from like a Saturn or a PlayStation, because those scratch pretty easily. So I remember not really ever a huge fan of RPGs, but I remember Chrono Trigger at the time when it came out. It was such an expensive game. I think it was like $89.99 Canadian. Very expensive. Video games were expensive back then. And I remember Chrono Trigger, I rented that. And that was like the first RPG that I ever got into. It's extremely accessible. It's not, full of lore like the Final Fantasy games are. And I think that's part of the reason why Chrono Trigger was so successful. It was very much westernized as far as being able to go in there, a little bit of a, time traveling aspect to it. We won't get into it here, but I'm just saying it was a very accessible RPG. And I remember I'd rent that, and you'd rent a game for like whatever it was, $3.99 or $4.99. You'd rent it, and you'd have to bring it back the next morning at like 11 o'clock. So if you're renting a game, you'd want to rent it as early as possible the day before, so you could maximize how long you'd have the game. Well, it's funny because you'd rent a game like Chrono Trigger, an RPG, and of course, just a young 12-year-old kid, you sit there and play that all day, but you wouldn't be able to get all the way to the end. And then, so what you'd end up doing is you'd rent the game again. And it would piss people off, because other people would go to the corner store the day that I had rented it, and there's like a little plastic rented plastic piece underneath the box. So people would get pissed off, and they come in the next day to rent it, and it would still be rented. So that was one of the games that we'd rent multiple times. Another one was obviously, Donkey Kong Country 1 and 2. Clay Fighter on the Super NES, used to rent that one quite a bit. Blackthorn was another staple that was always at the convenience store. I used to rent Blackthorn all the time. I literally, I'd rent it, return it. A week later, I'd rent it again. That's how it was back then. And it just went on and on and on like that. And I know a lot of times too, in the 90s, it wasn't really the age of the internet until late 90s. So when you went to Blockbuster Video, a lot of times what you saw on the box art was what you went by. It was living and dying by the seat of your pants. It was very much an entertaining time, because, like I said, you didn't know if you were renting a piece of shit game or a hidden gem or a game that everybody was talking about. All we had was GamePro, Electronic Gaming Monthly magazines, Nintendo Power, but there wasn't really anything as far as the internet is concerned. So yeah, a lot of times me and my father and my mother and my sister, we'd go to Blockbuster, and it was cool because what would happen is you'd go in there, and like the Genesis games as an example, they would all be on the shelf like this. And just, this is an example. Look at the box art on it. You'd look at it, you'd be like, what the fuck is that? And you'd more or less take a chance on it and bring it home. And, you know, you see the back of these boxes like this. A lot of times it was geared towards Blockbuster Video, because they knew when you picked up the game at the rental store, you'd have a few images to look at. And they'd always tell you if it was 1 player or 2 player. So when you went to Blockbuster, the Super NES carts, the boxes were obviously cardboard, and a lot of times they'd have them in a plastic sleeve, and then you'd take the box and then you'd bring it up to the cash, and then they'd give you the actual rental box. And I have one I'm going to show you guys here. It's actually a Genesis cart. It's for flashback. This is actually for Jumbo Video, so you can see it's not obviously like the box that comes with the game. It would look more like this. So yeah, this you get it like this. This still has the cheat codes in it that somebody put in there. That's how it was back then. But yeah, it's just a plain black box with a generic sleeve on it like that. So pretty cool. Kind of happy I have that in my collection. But I can remember even around 95, 96, we had the Super NES, but I still was always curious about the Genesis. Every time you'd go into Blockbuster Video or Jumbo Video, family would go look at the movies, the VHS, and I'd go right to the video game section. And you could actually rent the consoles as well, like the Genesis. You'd come in like a black plastic, like a briefcase almost, and you could rent it for like, I don't know, $20 for like a weekend. But we never really did that as a family. We already had the Super NES. But eventually we did get the Sega Saturn around 1995, 96. And I can remember renting a game called Mr. Bones. Not a lot of people talk about it now, but that was something that was just like, at the time, it was pretty cool to bring that home and play that. The original Myst on the Sega Saturn. I remember sitting there with my mother playing that. And again, extremely dated by today's standards, but back in 1995, 96, it was really impressive to see that. I remember, you know, the Saturn was not a popular console, but the one game that us Saturn owners could get excited about was Nights into Dreams. Never actually played it, but I remember it came with a special, kind of like a special controller. It was similar to it was Sega's answer to the N64's controller. And when you went to Blockbuster, you rent Nights, it would come with that controller. So yeah, good times renting video games. Of course, towards the early 90s or the early 2000s, that sort of phased away there. Blockbuster Video sort of went under. And but yeah, again, simpler times. Like I said, you'd go into the rental store and it was always a little bit of an unknown. There was a little bit of a danger factor. You didn't know what you were going to rent. And that's what's missing with today's day and age with video games. It's not the same. Everything's digital. Everything's at your fingertip. And, you know, it's lost a little bit of its charm in a way. Like I said, some of my fondest memories were going into the, like I said, the Blockbuster, the Jumbo Video, and looking at all the box art. And that's what, like I said, that's why you look back and you laugh at some of the box art that you see, especially on the Genesis and the Super NES, and you think it's ridiculous. But you have to understand, like I said, these companies needed to have the most outlandish box art just to catch your eye so you would rent the video game. And a lot of these companies, like I said, you know, they made their money off of people buying the game, but they also, like I said, I'm sure there was some sort of kickback from these rental corporations as well. But I know Basson's Black Bass, that was another one I used to rent a lot on the Super NES. Hank Parker's Black Bass, or Basson's Black Bass. Earthworm Jim 1 and 2, used to rent those all the time. And then, like I said, once we got closer to 2004, 2005, 2006, there wasn't so much, like I said, renting games. But yeah, that was a good time. So in a way, I'm kind of lucky I was born in 83, because I kind of got to live through, you know, that whole moment in time, which unfortunately, sadly, a lot of you younger viewers out there, you're never going to experience it. You're never going to be able to walk into a rental store with a shelf full of games like this, and you walk in and you look at them all, and you're in there for an hour and a half. Oh, which one should I rent? I got 2 of them in my hand. Which one should I rent? But like I said, I think the biggest pain in the ass was when there was a hot game, especially like Donkey Kong Country, or Super Mario RPG was another one that was really hot back in the day. What I mean by hot is, again, every time you go into the corner store or Blockbuster's Video, it's always rented. Always. You could never get your hands on it. A lot of times they would have a game like Donkey Kong Country. They'd have like several of them, just so there was enough for people to rent. That's how it was back then. And yeah, there's a few games out there that were exclusive to Jumbo Video or Blockbuster. So if you're a hardcore collector, it is something to definitely look into. But yeah, I just wanted to talk about some of my experiences growing up, like I said, with the rental market. And yeah, it is a shame it's not around anymore. But again, it's just not viable with the way things are today. Same with music and movies. It's just not the same. I busted out my VHS, my VCR last night just to watch some old movies. You know, there's more content on VHS than there ever was on DVD or Blu-ray. Can you wrap your head around that? So that's why it's good to keep a VCR lying around. There's a lot of good hidden gem VHS movies out there at the thrift store that you might be missing out on. So keep note of that. So that's going to do it, guys. That's my little talk on renting games back in the 90s. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching, guys. And get out there and enjoy that beautiful weather. Take care.